points in the same period. He's at 18%. Marco Rubio down at 11%. And Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Carly Fiorina, all in low single digits. Let's go first, Chuck Todd, to you. Donald Trump, we had polls yesterday in state polls in New Jersey, Chris Christie's New Jersey, where Trump way ahead of everybody, and Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush's Florida, Donald Trump way ahead of everybody, and in New Hampshire, Donald Trump showing a very strong lead there as well. Is it time for the Republican establishment in Washington, D.C. to go into a panic?
Well, perhaps. Maybe that's why you have the first negative ad campaign being prepared against him, and it happens to be by John Kasich's super PAC. But look, we're 1 week from the attacks, and there was a big assumption that Paris would change something in the Republican primary. Maybe it would hit Trump, maybe it hit Carson. I think what we've learned in the last week is that Carson is the one that's paid the price as in post-Paris. His handling of it, his inability to articulate a foreign policy vision and national security knowledge has hurt him, and you can see it hitting him. Trump, on the meantime, I know some thought maybe the Paris attacks would make the race, quote unquote, get serious, and that would hurt Trump. But I think a whole bunch of events, maybe the president being small, going on the attack himself, whatever it is, Trump seems stronger this week than he did last week, and you can't help but wonder, is this sort of the initial response by some voters in the Republican primary to almost gravitate back to Trump, back to strength, even if it's politically incorrect strength?
And Mark Halperin, it does come down to strength for Donald Trump. You boil his campaign down to one word, it's strength. You boil Ben Carson's campaign down to one word, it is character. They continued to dominate the conversation on the campaign trail yesterday. And at the center of it all, Donald Trump telling NBC that he would, quote, certainly implement a database system to track Muslims in the United States.
Should there be a database system that tracks the Muslims here in this country?
There should be a lot of systems beyond database. I mean, we should have a lot of systems. And today you can do it. But right now we have to have a border, we have to have strength, we have to have a wall, and we cannot let what's happening to this country happen.
But that's something your White House would like to implement.
Oh, I would certainly implement that. Absolutely.
Muslims specifically, how do you actually get them registered into a database?
It would be just good management. What you have to do is good management procedures. And we can do that. That's nice.
I mean, do you go to mosques and sign these people up into the system?
Different places. You sign them up at different, but it's all about management. Our country has no management. Who's this at?
Would they have to legally be in this database? Would it be their
They have to be. They have to be. Let me just tell you, the key is people can come to the country, but they have to come in legally. Thank you very much.
Mr. Trump, why would Muslim databases not be the same thing as requiring Jews to register in Nazi Germany? What would be the difference? Is there a difference between the two? Is there a difference?
Who are you with?
I'm with NBC News. Is there a difference between requiring Muslims to register and Jews?
You tell me.
Nazi Germany?
You tell me.
Do you believe?
Why don't you tell me?
Do you believe there is?
You tell me.
Should Muslims be, fearful? Will there be consequences if they don't register?
Trump's remarks about a Muslim registry came after a day in which 2 Syrian families were stopped at the border at Laredo, Texas. The Department of Homeland Security tells NBC News that they were regular migrants who made no attempt to evade authorities, but that information didn't stop Republican frontrunner from tweeting out a message of warning and posting this video on Instagram.
Syrians are now being caught at the southern border, just like I said. They're going to be pouring in. We don't know who they are. Could be ISIS. We need a new president fast.
And Ben Carson yesterday likened worrying about Syrian refugees to a parent's concerns about, quote, mad dogs.
You know, if there's a rabid dog running around in your neighborhood, you're probably not going to assume something good about that dog, and you're probably going to put your children out of the way. Doesn't mean that you hate all dogs by any stretch of the imagination. By the same token, we have to have in place screening mechanisms that allow us to determine who the mad dogs are, quite frankly. Who are the people who want to come in here and hurt us and want to destroy us? It's foolish for us to accept people if we cannot have the appropriate type of screening.
Bianna, I don't really know where to begin. Refugees being compared to dogs or mad dogs, a Muslim registry. I'll toss it to you. What's exactly going on out there?
Well, look, as someone who was privileged to come to this country at the age of 2 as a political refugee from the former Soviet Union, I mean, I get it. I'm sympathetic with these refugees. I understand what it's like. I was called a commie spy every day growing up by neighbors and friends coming from a communist country, but times have changed. The world has become more dangerous. We live in a post-9/11 world, and as Chuck Todd said, you know, go back to the president's comments, and many of them, like Chuck Todd said, or refer to them as being small, I think by the fact that he's not allowing Americans to understand that he's sympathetic with their concerns about the vetting process leads to these xenophobic comments that we're seeing now.
Yeah. So, Bianna, you say things have changed. So you're saying you're no longer a commie spy.
Exactly. That changed probably at the age of 3. Still debating, you know, the first few months. We quickly became capitalists.
Very good for you. I don't know if Bernie Sanders would agree with you, but I think that was a wise move. Ron Fortier, jump in here.
Well, I am a commie spy. Look,
yes, of course, we knew that.
Wasn't it Bill Clinton who said, I'd rather be wrong and strong than weak and right? Am I correct about that? That's what's going on here with Donald Trump. He'd rather be wrong and strong than weak and right. And I think the Republican Party, you know, obviously we all understand why this is a scary time, and it makes sense to be worried about who might be coming in, and let's look at all our laws. But all Republican Party voters, all Americans, but certainly Republican Party voters, got to wonder, you know, can the Republican Party be the party of life, for example, if it turns away refugees who fear for their lives? Can it be the party of religious freedom when it wants to tag, or at least its frontrunner wants to tag and track Muslims? We got to be really careful where we go here. We're heading into uncharted waters that are really scary.
Huge test right now for Marco.
You know what's interesting, though, is, Mark Halperin, is the fact that these Republican candidates are overreaching in a way that is unnecessary. The American people are not that far behind them in their concerns, not their overheated rhetoric or their offensive schemes to track and tag Muslims. But as far as fears regarding having Syrian refugees coming into this country, whether it is legitimate or not, the majority of the American people share their concerns. That's why the overheated rhetoric and the offensive rhetoric is so unnecessary.
It's a huge test for all these Republican candidates. I think Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz in particular right now, because they are both poised in the 3rd and 4th position in the national and most state polls. It's easy to go for the cheap moment to pander to the base of the party, to pander to the current popular sentiment. But can either of those guys or any of the other Republicans behind Carson and Trump find a way to speak more optimistically, bigger, and more forward-looking towards the general election electorate? We're not seeing much of that right now, but the opportunity is there.
You know, Chuck Todd, Marco Rubio has been hammered from all sides on immigration over the past week or so. We looked at Ben Carson's drop, but you've actually had Jeb's people going after Marco. You've had Trump going after Marco, and most heatedly, you've had Ted Cruz going after Marco. Now, this NBC poll, SurveyMonkey poll this morning, it's only one poll, but I do find it telling that Ted Cruz has jumped up 6 points or so. He's sitting at 18%. And he suddenly becomes, I was about to say the Republican establishment's candidate, but you talk about picking your poison for the Republican establishment. I think a lot of people in Washington would rather have Trump than Cruz, but that's quite a jump by Ted Cruz.
I'd love to see what I'd love to hand John McCain the choice. All right, Senator, Cruz or Trump? Look, I think Cruz has had a good week too behind the scenes. He's gotten some key endorsements in Iowa. You sort of see that there is he has an infrastructure on the conservative end of this race that is probably the best of all of them, of all the campaign infrastructure. So he's definitely in a good position. But let me say something larger about this week. This has been a horrendous week, I think, for American politics. I think it's been a terrible week for the Republican Party brand. I think watching the way that many of these candidates have responded to the attacks this week, there hasn't been a lot of great leadership moments. I mean, you've seen a lot of, we had, it's not just Trump and wanting to like tag Muslims. You heard the Carson comments. John Kasich wants to start an agency on Judeo-Christian values. It's not as if the president has been a great leader here. He's been small and petty, used his public forums to go after Republican critics rather than sort of channel the anxiety and frustration and anger and nervousness of the American public. So this has been, we're 1 week removed from the attacks, and I feel horrendous about American leadership right now, left and right.
Yeah.
Amen.
You know, Chuck, I'm so glad you said. I'm so glad you said that. We're here on a Friday, and you look back over this past week, and you see the shameful demagoguery on the Republican side of the ledger. You see the shameful lack of focus from the President of the United States. His G20 summit performance, which was just, as a Washington Post editorial page said, was petulant. And then the next day you see our Secretary of State speculating on the Charlie Hebdo attacks and suggesting that they were justified or at least logical. And then Republican responses to that. I think this has been a low point in American politics, and it shows that we have a lot of leaders that aren't up to the jobs that they've been promoted to do. And they need to step up to the task. Ron Fournier, did you want to jump in here?
No, it was Sam Stein.
I wrote
Sam
on Monday.
Stein, go.
I just want to say one
ahead.
thing off of Chuck's point, which is, I mean, the blatant whipping up of fear and panic that's happening is, as Chuck noted, something that's a bit sad. But you can't help but sort of contrast that, at least I can't, with how George W. Bush handled this debate during his tenure in office, where he went out of his way in talking about Islam as a religion of peace. And you look back at that and you say, well, you know, at least rhetorically, put it aside strategically and what he did in Iraq, at least rhetorically, that was a presidential way of handling these things. And I was very critical of the president on this show for his G20 summit. An earlier person said that they think that him getting down in the mud like that was what facilitated the Trump stuff. I disagree. I think that this Trump stuff precedes that. They're whipping up fear and panic. And I think the contrast here that we have to make is to George W. Bush and what he did during his tenure in office.
Yeah, there's no false equivalency here. There's no sense arguing over which party is least worse. They both have really, really stunk this week, and it's scary.
Yeah, I agree. I will say I was heartened yesterday to see Hillary Clinton's address before the Council on Foreign Relations. I thought she actually laid down a clear, coherent, strong approach to how we take on ISIS. And as critical as I have been and we have been of Hillary Clinton over the past 6 months, go back and look at her speech. That's what a leader looks like in a time of crisis. Chuck, what are you working on this week for Meet the Press?
Well, we're waiting to see what the administration is going to put out on what they want to do on ISIS in Paris. We're going to have Leon Panetta on the show. I'm looking forward to talking to him, former defense secretary, former head of the CIA under President Obama, not somebody who is shy about saying what he thinks ought to be done. And we'll have John Kasich on, and we're going to be tackling this issue on how this has been just I don't know how else to put it, but a bizarre week watching the Republican candidates respond to this.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. And still ahead on Morning Joe, new video coming in from our breaking news from Mali. State TV reporting that 80 of the 170 hostages have been released. We're going to have the very latest on that breaking story. We're following breaking news from Mali, where armed Islamic extremists stormed the Radisson Hotel at the country's capital earlier this morning, killing at least 3 people and initially taking hostages. Let's go to Thomas Roberts. He has more from Paris. Thomas.
Joe, we're getting very fluid and recent updates from one of my sources at the U.S. Embassy here in Paris talking about what's taking place. But just to brief everybody about the situation in Mali, the hotel is confirming they have 140 guests and 30 personnel that are working inside that building. What I can report and confirm is that we do have reports of United States government personnel that are working in that hotel, within the hotel. The numbers are still to be determined. But some of the initial reporting would indicate there are different branches involved here, several from the Department of Defense. But we are waiting to find out more confirmation from my source at the embassy. But once again, they would let me go as far as to say that there are United States government personnel within that hotel. They do not have confirmation on exactly what branch or department, but again, confirming that there are government employees in the hotel.
He's live in Brussels. He's, of course, been following the latest developments there very closely, but also the latest developments in Mali. Obviously, Eamon, this has been a war-torn country for some time, a heavy French presence, especially after you had the Islamists take over the country a few years ago in 2013. What can you tell us about the country and why we're seeing yet another massive terror operation there this morning?
Right. Well, it's important to emphasize we still don't know the identity of these gunmen who have taken the hotel hostage. But you're absolutely right. The country has been really suffering from a lot of turmoil over the past several years. And it began back in 2012 when the military in that country carried out a coup against the president. And shortly after that, the country saw an immediate split. You had a group of rebels in the northern part of the country, some affiliated with al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate that operates mostly in the western part of Africa. They began a rebellion and began to take over the northern part of the country. It was, at the time, a very disturbing scene to see Mali split up that quickly right after that military coup. That prompted international condemnation and led the French government at the time to lead a series of military campaigns to help dislodge some of those rebels from the northern part, some of those Islamist militants from the northern part of the country. They managed to successfully do that, but at a cost for the country. We've seen that over the past several years, despite the fact that the North has come back under the control of the central government, there are still a series of attacks that take place as a result of some of those militant groups that are operating in the North. Just this past March, a militant group attacked a popular restaurant in the capital that killed at least 5 people. So this is a country that has had a turbulent past, particularly with al-Qaeda affiliated rebels in the northern part of the country, Joe.
Eamon, Mark Halpern here. Do you know how much of an American presence, how much of a European presence there is in the capital and in Mali in general?
Well, we have a general picture, not necessarily sure exactly how many were at the hotel, but I can tell you here's what we know from official news agencies and state-controlled media. We know that there was a substantial Chinese presence in the country, and there are Chinese hostages among those at the hotel. That is according to the official Chinese state news agency. We also know from the Turkish state media that there were at least 6 Turkish employees of Turkish Airlines that are at that hotel as well. Now, the U.S. Embassy has not confirmed or denied the presence of Americans in that situation. There are some eyewitness accounts of those that have been released that have said there are Westerners, there are foreigners inside that hotel. In terms of the big picture, we know that France has about 1,000 troops on the ground in that country. We also know that the United Nations has a very active mission that is headquartered in Bamako. The area where this hotel is, west of the city, is very close to a lot of government ministries, government buildings. It is very common for a lot of these diplomats, a lot of government agencies to meet at hotels like this. This is considered a luxury hotel in Bamako, so it would not be, at the time that this raid took place or this attack took place, it would not have been uncommon to see or have Western officials, perhaps even businessmen, at that hotel. We also know that the Dutch government has about 450 troops as well in Mali. So by most accounts, there is a pretty substantial foreign presence, particularly in the capital, which makes this particular attack that much more daring. The fact that they've been able to go right into the heart of the government, close to government ministries that are pretty well secured, and take over a luxury hotel with about 140 hostages is going to be extremely troubling news for the Malian government, how this managed to happen.
All right, Eamon Moldeen, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it. Let's go. We're following breaking news out of Mali. There are now reports of fatalities in the hostage situation there. Let's go to Chris Jansing with the latest update. Chris, what do you have?
Joe, thanks. The AP is sourcing a Malian army commander who says about 20 hostages were released. Remember, there were 170 to start. Also, a military official says at least 3 people have been killed. All of this has been unfolding over the last couple of hours at the Radisson Blu Hotel in central Mali. That's a U.S.-owned hotel. A spokesperson tells NBC News the hostages include about 140 guests and about 130 employees. Now, the AP says 10 gunmen. The first report was 2. Now they're saying 10 gunmen stormed the hotel, shouting in Arabic, "God is great," before firing on guards. There are also reports that hostages who could recite verses from the Quran are the ones who they released. We also know that President Obama has been briefed on the situation, and Susan Rice is the one who gave him that briefing. He's continuing to get updates on that. Now, let me bring you.
In the wake of the Paris attacks, Europe's refugee crisis has taken a sharp turn. Took a really sharp turn yesterday after the Balkan nations of Serbia, Macedonia, Croatia, and Slovenia announced that they were going to be shutting their borders to economic migrants and only allow refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan to pass. That created huge log jams of desperate people along the Balkan border. Some 1,500 migrants were left stranded in the no man's land between Macedonia and Greece, while another 300 were stranded along Serbia's border with Croatia after being denied entry. Here in the United States, defying a veto threat from President Obama, the House of Representatives yesterday passed legislation that would drastically tighten the screening protocol for Syrian and Iraqi refugees entering America. 47 Democrats joined the vast majority of Republicans in supporting the bill, and it passed by a vote of 289 to 137, giving the 2/3 support needed to override that presidential veto.
If our law enforcement and intelligence community cannot verify that each and every person coming here is not a security threat, then they shouldn't be allowed in. Right now, the government can't certify these standards. So this plan pauses the program. When we have indications that some of the Paris bombers, one at least, may have come through the refugee routes, don't you think that common sense dictates that we should take a pause and get this right?
Meanwhile, in the Senate, Ted Cruz and Rand Paul each tried and failed to pass bills on their own on how to admit refugees to the United States. Cruz introduced legislation that would bar all refugees from countries that contain territory, quote, substantially controlled by a terrorist organization. It included an exception for groups that are identified as victims of genocide.
In response to my acknowledging genocide as a different circumstance, President Obama 2 days ago in Turkey attacked me directly, said it was un-American to want to protect this country from terrorists and to want to help persecuted Christians. The president refuses to say the words radical Islamic terrorism. Hillary Clinton refuses to say the words radical Islamic terrorism. But not only do they refuse to say the words, but they are supporting a policy of bringing tens of thousands of Syrian Muslim refugees into this country, knowing full well that we cannot vet them to determine who is coming here to wage jihad.
You know, Sam Stein, we are seeing Republicans take the lead, obviously, in the early part of this debate. You're now seeing some Democrats coming along being concerned not only about refugees, but also the guest visa program that we've all been talking about for the past 3 days. But you're also starting to see concerns, obviously, in Europe. We saw it in the Balkans. And, of course, Angela Merkel is going to be facing, well, a huge political blowback for some of the progressive policies that she's taken on bringing in refugees. I sense this debate is going to become much more complicated than just a Republican versus the rest of the world debate, that we're starting to see what countries around Syria have been experiencing now for well over a year. A real crisis that doesn't have any quick fix.
Yeah, well, it already is more complicated than partisan fault lines when you have 47 House Democrats voting for this bill yesterday under what I'm told is intense pressure they felt politically to do something. And I'm also told that they left a meeting with Obama administration officials basically unsatisfied with how the administration was defending the current screening apparatuses. So, you know, those are two factors that came into the 47 defections here. But let's step back for a second. 2 points. One is sort of the long-term strategic point that Graham was talking about here, which is this helpful for what we're trying to do with respect to ISIS in terms of both PR battle as well as just a humanitarian one? And then secondly, I think it's important to realize you know, as much as we feel this sort of innately at home here, and certainly we have our own history with 9/11, our situation is dramatically different than the Europeans. The screening process here is far more rigorous than what's happening in Europe. The refugees, on average, take about 18 to 24 months to be resettled in the United States, which is an inordinate amount of time if you're a member of ISIS who wants to actually get into the United States. So as you pointed out, we have a different circumstance here. The travel visa program is a much bigger vulnerability that wasn't addressed yesterday. And if the standard that Paul Ryan is suggesting is 100% certainty that there are no threats, then there are a whole host of other things. None of the 9/11 hijackers, for instance, were refugees. They got here on travel visas and student visas. So we need to sort of recalibrate how we're thinking about this.
We may, and yeah, we've been talking about it the past few days, we may actually, in focusing so much on these refugees, we may be missing the much more difficult situation for us and the much larger crisis as it comes to visa guests that come here through visas. Because you look at the situation in Europe, and you can read the news, you can even look at the images, and you can see Europe doesn't have the same screening system that the United States has. That said, Kristen, this obviously has become a hot button issue. You have people like Donald Trump and Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, others trying to each outflank each other on who's toughest in keeping refugees out of this country. It may be great Republican politics in 2015, but how does it play in 2016 when we go to a general election where Republicans have been winning more and more older white voters and losing more and more of the rest of the demographic breakdowns?
What I think is notable about this issue is the way that there is such a significant sort of broader-based coalition in favor of taking a look at how we screen refugees, that this isn't necessarily an issue, as the vote in the House yesterday showed, that breaks down strictly along party lines. There was the Bloomberg poll from earlier this week that showed about over a third of Democrats saying that we should not allow in any refugees. This wasn't even just a question about should we rethink our policies, but you had a majority of Americans, including over a third of Democrats, saying we shouldn't let in anyone. Now, I don't necessarily
Kristen,
think that I think that's a great policy.
Let me interrupt you here and say, let me clarify a little bit here. So yes, Republicans are on the right side if you want to just look at the polls with the American people. There is no doubt that Americans are much closer to where the mainstream of the Republican Party is on refugees than they are the Obama administration. You could say the same thing on fighting the war on terror. The Republicans are in a much stronger position because of just how badly the president has played his hands over the past 48 hours, pathetically, in fact. But when you have Donald Trump talking about databases for Muslims, when you have Ben Carson mentioning rabid dogs in the same sentence with Syrian refugees, when you have these sort of statements following the Republican frontrunners around, what is the long-term impact of that on the Republican Party for swing voters in the suburbs of Philadelphia or in the outskirts of Detroit, Michigan, places Republicans have to win if they're going to get back to the White House?
Well, I think that the rhetoric that both Donald Trump and Ben Carson have used in this situation, it's not exclusive to the refugee situation that I think would cause problems for Republicans in a general election. I think the fact that Donald Trump says he wants to create a national database of Muslim citizens is abhorrent, and I think you would find an awful lot of citizens who, once you take it to that kind of extreme, then you're moving beyond, hey, should we do prudent things about making sure that we're welcoming refugees but are not exposing ourselves to a great deal of threat. But I think that Donald Trump's threat to the Republican Party goes beyond just the statements of the last couple of days. I think it stretches back over the course of his campaign and a lot of the rhetoric that he's deployed.
Yeah, you look at the Bloomberg poll that we just put up while you were talking, the overwhelming majority of Americans say don't accept any Syrian refugees. 53%, only 28% say still accept 10,000, and 11% say take only Christians. This is a bipartisan concern, and let's hope that a bipartisan Congress can work with the president and get a reasoned, rational, sane policy put forward. We continue to follow breaking news from Mali. The Associated Press is now reporting at least 3 people are dead, sourcing a military official. There are also reports that hostages who could recite verses from the Quran were allowed to go. Still ahead on Morning Joe, we're going to be talking now to NBC News senior White House correspondent Chris Jansing live in Paris. Of course, Chris, you've been there covering the terror attacks in Paris that happened a week ago tonight. What's the very latest there?
Well, there's a lot going on, and let's start in the Netherlands, Joe, where authorities are on heightened alert in Rotterdam. Police have detained 3 people near a parked car with Belgian license plates. The police say the car gave officers reason to further investigate, but they're not offering why it was treated as suspicious or the identities of the 3 people. We're also learning more about the suicide bomber who blew herself up in Wednesday morning's raid. Now, of course, she is the first woman suicide bomber in Europe and the first affiliated with ISIS. NBC News believes she is Hasna Aitboulachen, though her name has not been officially released by French authorities. The mayor of the town, where her father has lived since 2005, tells NBC she was born in a northwestern suburb of Paris in 1989. That was after her family moved to that region back in the 70s. And there are then these photos that have been out there and causing quite a sensation, frankly, on social media from DailyMail.com. They depict her as a modern young woman taking selfies, as you see here. There's another one of her in a bubble bath wearing only a necklace. Now, her brother told the Daily Mail she had no interest in religion, never read the Quran. She'd only started wearing a Muslim veil about a month ago. Meanwhile, French authorities have led more than 400, actually 600 house searches since Friday's attack. That was a new number they put out overnight. And they are set to extend the state of emergency for the next 3 months. That would ease restrictions for searches and arrests. And some of the things that are happening here, for example, under those powers, soup kitchens that are operating are not allowed to operate. There's obviously the big climate summit that is coming up. And a lot of people are not coming now because under those emergency powers, they will not be having those big protests. And Belgium's prime minister says he is ready to spend an extra 400 million euros to increase security measures there. That is a doubling of their security budget. Joe?
All right. Thank you so much, Chris Jansing in Paris. And it really is. It's just remarkable how many of these people that have been engaged with ISIS and terror attacks had no religious background, no examples of religious freedom. In fact, had been more involved in drugs and petty theft than in religious extremism. And the shots of this fairly modern woman born and living in Paris who hadn't even worn a veil until a month ago, really troubling. Well, let's talk about ISIS a bit. U.S. and coalition military forces are continuing their attacks against ISIS militants in Iraq and in Syria. The Department of Defense reported 8 more strikes in Syria and 19 more strikes in Iraq yesterday. They are picking up the pace, just as the Secretary of Defense told us they would. This week, airstrikes have been targeting ISIS oil productions. That's a main source of revenue, of course, for the terror group. Some estimates are that they make up to $50 million a year on a month on the black market. And according to the Pentagon, the military dropped leaflets warning truck drivers to abandon their rigs before they were destroyed. Russia's defense ministry claims that their air force has been targeting ISIS oil refinery assets as well. Let's bring in right now to talk more about this, editor for the Atlantic magazine, Graham Wood. Graham, you know, I remember, I guess it was about 6 months ago, reading your article, I guess right before it came out, and immediately calling you up, and read it a day or two ago after all of this happened. And boy, it still remains the most relevant article to understanding what's going on with ISIS. Bring us up to date over the past 6 months since you wrote that article and what we're seeing now in Paris and across the globe.
Yeah, so the ideology of ISIS remains the same. You know, they still want to build a caliphate. They still believe that they are the only true Muslims and that everybody who opposes them, including most people who identify as Muslims all over the world, are actually apostates and need to be fought. The real change, though, is Paris. You know, building a state and having spectacular attacks on Western targets are usually considered two different things, and if you do one, you can't really do the other. It was an Al-Qaeda style project to have big attacks on the West, and ISIS used to say to Al-Qaeda, you got it wrong. You know, you did 9/11, and what did it get you? You got you invaded. So now apparently they've kind of reversed the tide. They used to be telling people, don't attack in Paris, don't attack in New York, instead come to Syria. And now they're reversing the tide, and 2,000 people have gone from France to Syria, and now they seem to be suggesting that old Al-Qaeda strategy is one that's still alive. So it's a major strategic shift for the organization.
You know, Graham, we played after the Paris attacks a clip from Homeland where you actually had somebody explaining to military generals what their strategy was. Said, we don't have a strategy, but they do. And then when the question was asked, well, what's their strategy? What's ISIS strategy? And it seemed like Homeland lifted the words almost directly from your article. It's all about the end times. It's all in the book that they read every day. They are trying to create a caliphate that will lead to the end times and the death of all infidels. And that's why we see the beheadings. That's why we see all the things that we're seeing. I mean, that is, at the end of the day, their goal is to bring about the end times based on their religious reading of the Quran.
Yeah, they're still at it. You know, even when they took credit for the downing of that Russian airliner, their statement said, we're waiting for you. The prophecy says you're coming, Crusaders. And they even named the place where they expected the battle to take place, a valley called Amek in Syria. So it's still very much part of the ideology that the fight is coming, that it was foretold 1,400 years ago, and for the Islamic State, it's going to be a great thing. That they're gonna succeed, and then they'll bring about the Antichrist's arrival, and then eventually the return of the prophet Jesus, who will lead the Muslims in battle and ultimate victory.
Mark Halperin.
What is the weakness currently, if any, that they're showing? Where are their vulnerabilities right now?
Well, the good news is that in Iraq itself, they're actually losing territory. I mean, over the last year, they've lost quite a bit of space. And there's a string of battles that we could name, Kobani, Beji, one after the other. They're losing space. They're losing territory to mostly Kurdish teams that have been assisted by the United States and others. So I think partially this change in strategy, it may have something to do with the fact that their old model of expanding by conquest not working so great in their core territory. They might have decided time to try something else, or at least give our brand a boost